Hello humans, my name is Cecil and welcome to another episode of Custom Hammer. On this channel we focus on building 3D printed models, and if this sounds good, welcome. I'm sorry I'm looking at my notes here, YouTube is pretty new to me. So anyhow, although I paint what I make, I just want to mention that the main focus of this channel is how to build a model. In case you are mostly interested on how to paint a model, then I suggest you should watch Ground Affected. I believe Father does a great job. Now, this model is Jean Grey slash Phoenix. It is sculpted by Wicked. They also have a Patreon group, and I believe you should definitely check them out. As you can see, the model is massive. It's a quarter scale, and due to the size, there were some challenges. For example, I wanted to be able to disassemble the model whenever I want and make it solid. So in order to do that, there was some engineering involved. I couldn't just glue the parts together and call it done. Because I print my models hollow, I use polyester resin to fill them up later on to make them solid. And I couldn't do that specifically on this model because if I were to fill it all up with polyester, it would be very hard to handle because of the weight, of the added weight. So I had to get creative. What I ended up doing is on the base and the flames, I put expanding foam. It's called polyurethane expanding foam. And at the body itself, filled it up with resin. At the end, the center of gravity remained where it should be. So the model is quite stable, you see. And at the end, I say I'm pretty pleased how it turned out. But some gaps here and there, those gaps, although they are the bane of my existence, I had to leave them because I want to disassemble the model. And with that said, I believe we can proceed to the video. This is the expanding foam I mentioned, and it helps create a core that is light and durable. So when I want to put pins later on, I can use polyester putty. The putty in conjunction with the foam creates a more rigid area so that the pins would not fall inside the hollowed piece. And of course, the foam makes a total mess. As I said in the intro, for the figure itself, I wanted to fill it up with polyester resin. And what you see me doing here is that I fill the gaps and the small holes left behind from the 3D printing process. Because I'm about to use a resin that is low viscous, very runny, I have to make sure I plug all the holes first. So I simply identified the holes, and using a marker I marked the holes I wanted to close. This step helps to make the holes more visible to me. Then I mixed some polyester putty, and with the help of a toothpick I closed all the holes. Obviously in the end I left 2 holes open on each piece so that I could fill it up later with resin. Keep in mind that you always need at least 2 holes on the top spot of each piece that you want to fill up. One for pouring and one to let the air out. Here in this segment, as you can see, I am about to prepare the model for pouring. The steps in general are as follows. Take the resin that you want, in this case it's polyester, put some resin in a cup, then mix thoroughly with a few drops of hardener. Make sure to follow the vendor's instructions and measure properly the 2 parts. Now, in another cup, prepare some additive, in this case a special type of sand. For bigger parts, such as the torso, you start with some resin, then pour in some additive, then some resin again, and so on and so forth. With this technique, you create temporary layers, and the additive will sink down to the lowest point eventually. But in the end, you will have two distinct layers. The top will have only polyester resin, and the bottom of the part will have mostly the additive. The reason to do it this way is because larger parts, such as the torso, tend to trap air bubbles if you put in the additive first and then the resin. The additive will trap air, and as the resin hardens, you will end up with huge gaps and/or bubbles. You don't want that. Note that there are special tools to remove air bubbles, such as vibrators and vacuum chambers, but they are expensive and I don't have any. Lastly, you can use a syringe, as you see me doing here, and instead of pouring the resin, you can actually inject it. This helps a lot if you have small holes to work with and if you have to deal with weird shaped parts. I'm using some masking tape to mask some really small holes that I missed in the previous step, and also to keep clean the part at the places where I'm handling it. What you see me doing here with this special carving tool is that I make the holes a little bit larger so that I can inject the resin just a little easier. Also, if you see at the leg that is on the back, bubbles are still coming up even though I was very careful. Now I'm about to use my favorite polyester putty. This type of putty that I use is called marble glue. It is a type of putty that hardens very much, and you can also use it for sculpting. It looks like Bondo at first glance, but in reality it's a glue. Oh yes, the pins. I can't stress enough how important this step is. It stabilizes the model and it makes your life way easier down the road. You can handle the model from the pins, you always have perfect alignment, and most of all, the pins don't fail like glue. For example, if you use only CA glue and don't pin your models, at some point in the future the model will just fall apart because the glue will give out. Also keep in mind that when you are gluing two parts together, regardless if you use pins or not, the surface that you will apply the glue needs to be super clean, free of dust and oils from your hands, not primed, not painted, and a little bit lightly sanded with sandpaper. About the pins, the process is very simple. After the resin hardens, you take a drill and you drill the hole where you imagine you should put a pin. The best place to put your pins is at the center of the peg on a part. The drill bit that I'm using is for metal. They are quite sharp and I believe it's the best choice to drill on resin. In this case I am using a 2mm drill bit. I also use a 2mm galvanized steel wire for the pins. I use 2mm for heavy parts, and for smaller and lighter parts I use 1mm paper clips and the corresponding 1mm drill bit. On very rare occasions I use both, 2mm for stability and 1mm for alignment. This is very rare, and I happen to use this technique on her waistcloth thing on this statue. Well, as you can see, I did an oopsie and I drilled too deep on her torso and the drill came right through, but don't worry, I fixed it later with some putty. When you're drilling to put pins, you should hold the two parts together and drill part A from the outer side and continue drilling on part B on the inside, so that the holes align perfectly. If this is not possible, you drill on one part and put your pin as straight as you can, and on the other part you make the hole quite bigger in diameter. If you do it this way, you put putty on the bigger hole and Vaseline on the part with the pin. Then, when the putty hardens, it will leave behind a hole that matches and aligns perfectly with the pin. This is how I did the pins on her arms. Now that I put my pins and I'm happy, it's time to fill in some gaps. What I'm doing here is that I put some Vaseline on the torso part, let's call it part A, and I applied putty on part B. Because the Vaseline creates a layer, when the putty hardens, it will fill in the gaps, but it won't glue the pieces together. This leg segment is mostly uncut footage, and I'm going to show you how I pinned the legs using the technique that I mentioned before, where you make bigger holes on one part. I drilled a 2mm hole on each leg and I put a piece of steel wire to use as a pin. I inserted the steel wire into the peg, and at this point I am only dry fitting, no glue whatsoever. Now that the dry fitting looks fine, I took a very small amount of polyester glue / putty and I glued in the pins in the pegs. Dry fit again, and with the help of some Vaseline I applied on the legs everywhere. At this point you need to be generous with the Vaseline and also apply a little bit on the outside, as you can see, because you don't want the putty to drip and make a mess everywhere. Now I take a generous amount of putty and mix in some hardener. Mix thoroughly and apply a good amount on the part with the bigger holes that you are about to glue. Press fit the parts together, and after a while, when the putty starts to harden, remove any excess putty with the help of a hobby knife. it's time to glue the base. Before applying any glue, I lightly sand the area that the glue will go, and of course, before I do anything permanent, I need to dry fit. The baking paper that you see I'm using here will help me later on to make the base really flat. You will see why. Now I took some polyester putty and I start to glue the base together piece by piece. Before I started with wet sanding, I took a chisel and re-scribed some lines on her boots to make them a little more defined. Then I continued on with wet sanding. Wet sanding is a great technique and you can use a variety of sandpapers or sanding sponges, and the main advantage is that the dust doesn't fly off everywhere and the results are super fine. Also, a great advantage is that as you sand, the temperature doesn't go up because of friction, and more sensitive parts such as small plastic parts don't melt. This helps create a more defined and better surface overall. Although admittedly you will need a power tool to melt plastic with sanding, keep in mind that you can wet sand even when using power tools. You just only dip the part in the water and not the tool itself. Wet sanding is great when you have flat, smooth surfaces, for example if you make model cars or if you are into Gunpla. One thing that I absolutely hate is that when a statue wiggles. That is why I always put a lot of effort into making the base flat. There is no point showing you that, but I went outside and sanded the base flat. Now with the help of my Dremel, I sand off any imperfections that I see on the wing pieces. Here you see me working on some imperfections on her body. I am using a mixture of CA glue mixed with baby powder, aka talc. This mixture is one of my favorite solutions. It gives really good results and also it's very quick, especially if you use an activator. An activator is a liquid that you spray after applying CA glue and it hardens the glue instantly. Within 3 seconds tops, the glue is fully hardened. When using an activator, keep in mind that you always need to wear a mask because it is extremely volatile. On her emblem I used my chisel to give some more depth and define the lines better. I do this with certain areas because when the lines are shallow they get filled up with primer later on and then there's nothing left and the details are lost. So that's why it's a good idea to chisel away stuff like emblems, lines on boots and everywhere else that I see fit. This line scribing technique is very well known and best suited for Gunpla. When scribing panels of a Gundam, it is called panel scribing or panel lining, and that's where the ink panel liner from Tamiya gets its name from. Here you see me using some Tamiya putty to fix some minor issues at the base. I always wanted to try wood putty to fill in some small holes, and I must say it's not my cup of tea. You see, wood putty doesn't harden very much when dry, and at the end of the day, whatever materials you use, keep in mind that you want them to cure as hard as the resin that you printed your model. They need to have the same hardness, otherwise you will create a seam that will be very visible after applying primer. Here I'm just sanding the model, nothing special about it, but I wanted to show you that I used these nylon disc things that are very much appropriate for sanding 3D printed resin models. They come in different colors and shapes and they are quite cheap, but more importantly excellent for this job. Please note that different colors represent different hardness. This is the first time that I assembled the whole model together. Everything is pinned, and as you can see, I marked with a marker where I needed to do some corrections, such as on her head. Bath time with warm water and soap. The goal here is to wash everything thoroughly, because if I don't clean any Vaseline residue, the primer just won't stick. Also, remove any dust. And at long last, I'm about to apply the first layer of primer. At this stage, I usually go with filler primer. This is a primer that also fills in small imperfections, hence the name. I don't need to spray the whole model with it. I use it on flat surfaces and on the seams because gaps are the bane of my existence. Please note that this primer usually comes off because after this stage I usually sand again now that I can see imperfections better. Therefore keep in mind that a primer has two roles. Firstly, to help the paint adhere, and secondly, to bring out your mistakes and imperfections. Now that the filler primer has dried and it's the next day, I started applying black primer on her body, on the lower base and on the diamond things. Then I applied white primer on the rest of the model because it consists mostly of supposedly fire, and because fire burns hotter near the center, I wanted all the crevices to be primed with white in order to look brighter, because when the fire burns hotter, it has a whiter flame. Later on you will see me do a zenithal highlight, but with a small twist. I will use white primer on the model itself, but black primer for the fire. When you want to perform a zenithal highlight, you must always assemble the whole model together. Well, I had the brightest idea to make her eyes glow in the dark, and it turns out it was awful. I didn't like it at all. Eventually, I painted her eyes white again.
Lighten up, take me on your magic river. Tell me all your dreams align. Sign me up.
Anyway, for the diamonds I used the marble technique. This one is quite easy. First you paint the part black and you put a dry baby wipe over the piece. The baby wipe needs to be stretched so that through the holes the paint can go to the piece underneath. After a while, after you spray the paint, that is, you take the baby wipe off and ta-da! Marble!
I wanna hear about everything you're ever
and after the marble paint was done, I used some ink to paint the gems. I used emerald and purple inks from Winsor & Newton.
No time is on our side. Things are gonna haunt us. We'll just have to put aside. Now right here, if you just need to.
I started painting the body using green and red contrast paints from Citadel and Tamiya paints for the yellow parts. The best way to paint yellow is to paint pink first. I tried to paint yellow without pink base and it looked awful, so also I accidentally touched one leg and I decided to repaint it, this time properly. On the cloth on her waist I used metallic pink and then metallic yellow from scale 75. After that I used some clear yellow from Tamiya until I was satisfied with the outcome. For her face I used 3 different colors from scale 75, basic flesh, pink flesh and a lighter tone for the highlights. And I built up her skin layer by layer. After that I used very thin clear colors from Tamiya as washes, green, yellow, red and blue, to make her skin a little more interesting. After that I painted her eyebrows and lips. As I mentioned before, I didn't like her eyes, so I corrected them using white ink from Winsor & Newton. Also, I used a little black around her eyes to make her eyes stand out, something like a mascara. Then, when her face was completed, I used some UV resin on her eyes. This makes her eyes nice in person, but kind of awkward in the photos. After masking her emblem, I first painted it black and then I used titanium gold for the phoenix itself. After it dried, I used some clear orange on the center of the phoenix emblem because the fire of the phoenix that burns within us all comes from within. Now, for the flames I used inks, mostly orange ink as the base color and trying to keep the shadows and the highlights from the zenithal priming. After the orange ink I used some red contrast paint, and when using inks try to go slow because they are very runny. Also, I am using a hairdryer to speed up the process, advancing layer to layer. After I finished painting the base color, I took some plastic wrap and masked the body of the model, assembled it, and then I put the final touches on the flames. At this stage I used green ink at specific areas to help bring out the red color. Yes, green. Green is a complementary color to red and helps to make the flame pop. Last but not least, on the feathers I used a black contrast paint and then I dry brushed a metallic gold, and after the dry brush I used some grey contrast paint to kind of blend everything together because I don't like the finish of the dry brush. It's kind of dull. At this point I called it good. Well, we now reached the end of the video, and here are my closing thoughts. I tend to keep this segment always unscripted. Well, I believe this model is quite fun to make, but also very difficult. It's definitely not for a beginner. I really hope you liked it, and I'm really sorry I didn't post a video. I was kind of busy. Anyhow, I thank you very much for watching, and I see you on the next one, which is Terra Brantford from Final Fantasy VI.